Hello. Today's video is going to look at Joanne Baillie's poem A Child to His Sick Grandfather, a poem that frankly I find to be a big dollop of mawkish slop. However, it's on the syllabus, so we've got to suck it up, we've got to study it. To that end, we're going to analyse 2 features of structure, 2 of language and 2 contextual factors before marrying it all together and producing the kind of barnstorming, award-winning paragraphs that in a given examiner a right old jolly time of it. Now, I'm not sure you can talk about the plot of a poem, as it were, but you know what I mean. I'm going to give you now the bare-bones summary and overview of what occurs in the poem. And you've got a child that's worrying about the physical decline of his granddad. And after recalling some very fond memories of their time together, this young narrator goes on to describe how haggard and forlorn and just drained and exhausted the old boy looks now. After that, the narrator outlines all the things that he's going to do to make sure that granddad's life is that little bit easier. And these reassurances, these platitudes lead on to the child spinning a few yarns, telling a few tales to occupy the old boy. Bit of a downbeat ending. It's an inference in that last line that the old boy dies. I guess if you want to be PG certificate about it, you could possibly extrapolate an interpretation. You could possibly infer that he falls asleep. But either way, it's a pretty downbeat, bleak ending. Of the 2 language features we're going to look at in this poem, first one is alliteration. When she's talking about the old man's physical appearance, she talks about the white hairs on your crown, how wan and hollow are your cheeks. So it's clear here that this old boy is not exactly a pulsating picture of health. Disease or 10 years teaching can do that to a man. And this frail appearance is presented to us through the alliteration of the W sound. You've got white, crown, how, wan, hollow. There's a job lot of words for you. Well, whoop-de-doo, Mr. Taylor, you found some alliteration. Give yourself a hug, you genius with a capital J, you. Really, though, we're giving people 3/5 of naff all unless we also say what the effect of this alliteration is. Don't just state the poem as alliteration, say why it uses it. And that's what I've done here. That W sound, W, I would argue, ushers in a kind of saddle, melancholic tone. And that's capturing the narrator's grief that he feels about Grandad dying. Staying with this quotation for a moment, we're going to drill down and see if we can't winkle out some more goodies. An examiner loves it when you can go back into that evidence and pick out something else to analyse. Now let's have a look at that noun, crown. The white hairs on your crown. He's got very few hairs on his crown. So, you know, on one level, he's the comb-over kid. He's a balding old boy. Happens to the best of us. But that use of the word crown is significant. And it's significant because crown has connotations of royalty. You know, a king wears a crown. And what's this bringing to the party? Well, this is bringing to the party the idea that the child has this deep reverence and esteem for his granddad, you know, like a citizen would have for a monarch. In short, then, that royal connotation of crown is just suggesting the high respect the narrator has for his granddad. Why have I highlighted that exclamation mark at the end of cheeks? How wan and hollow are your cheeks? Well, that's simply Baillie's way of telegraphing the narrator's shock and horror that the boy feels seeing his granddad looking so tragically old and infirm. The other language technique that will winkle out this poem is metaphor. In stanza 6, you've got the line, when the fire turns blue, I'll sit and talk with you. Now, before we fret about the metaphorical significance of this phrase, let's just think about its literal meaning first. Because what it's showing, you know, the fact that the boy's prepared to sit by the fire with his granddad, is the depth of that child's love for the granddad. You know, the boy's going to be there to care for, to protect the granddad until late in the day. In a sense, then, you've got the idea that the boy is helping stave off one of the biggest killers of the elderly, loneliness. But Mr. Taylor has a witch's nose for a metaphor, and there is one in here if you tinker and dig around deep enough, because when it talks about the fire turning blue, that might suggest metaphorically that the grandfather's life, the kind of flame of his life, if you will, his life force is ebbing away, draining away. Slowly but surely, his life, like a flame, is being extinguished. What's that line from Macbeth? Out, out, brief candle. We've done language. On to structure now. We'll focus on repetition. And you'll notice, with the exception of the 6th stanza, every stanza of this poem in the last line contains the term dad, when the narrator is referring to the granddad. And in the spirit of achieving the highest marks, we'll try and pull out 2 interpretations for this repetition of the term dad. Now, firstly, you give somebody a nickname. That tends to be a sign that you've got a close relationship with them. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to this. When the mouth-breathing knuckleheads at my high school were calling me Monkey-Faced Taylor, I don't think that was a term of endearment. But, when people call me Jono or JT or the law, as in Taylor, I think that's a sign of affection unless I've completely misread the relationship. There's a warmth there. But, of course, it's significant that the narrator calls the granddad Dad, because this is suggesting that the old guy is like a father to him. And arguably the parent-child relationship is going to be deeper and closer than that exists between a grandparent and child. The last structural feature that we'll look at today is rhyme scheme. Now, it amazes me how many students and the odd teacher think it's okay to knock off early after just telling you what the rhyme scheme is. If I was to say to you, this is an AABB-CC rhyme scheme, toodles them off the pub, I wouldn't be doing justice to myself, because what you need to do is, if you are going to mention the rhyme scheme, make sure to analyse it, to answer the question, why did the poet use it? And our first interpretation for this poem's rhyme scheme, where you've got rhyming couplet after rhyming couplet after rhyming couplet, is that it creates a kind of sing-song rhyme scheme that's reminiscent, suggestive of a nursery rhyme. And what this is doing is just very cleverly capturing or sculpting the childlike voice of the young narrator. Obviously, Baillie was not a kid when she wrote this poem, but the narrator's character is that of a child. The other thing to notice about this rhyme scheme is that it's a fixed rhyme scheme. Every stanza abides by or conforms to that AABBCC form. And a fixed rhyme scheme can be suggestive of ideas of restraint or containment, of things being inescapable or inevitable. Therefore, when Baillie's using this fixed rhyme scheme, what that's capturing or suggesting is perhaps the inevitability of the granddad's decline and death. The idea that life, like the structure of the poem, is inflexible. The old boy is locked in this doomed downward cycle. Just to recap that high-level idea then, a fixed rhyme scheme capturing the fixed, inescapable certainty that the granddad's going to die. Okay, so we've analysed the writer's use of craft, language and structural techniques to achieve certain effects. Next step, context, linking this poem to the era it was written and significant details about the poet's life. Now, it's significant that Joanne Baillie was raised a Christian, because for better or worse, religion shapes your thoughts and it shapes your behaviour. And we can play kind of armchair psychologist here and say that this poem, capturing the love she has for her granddad, is in a way reflective of her Christian faith, because one of the commandments in the Bible is honour thy father and mother. So this poem, in a sense, is mirroring or echoing what she would have had hammered into her head from the year dot, that a father figure is something to revere and respect. Another link we can make between the era when this poem was written and the poem itself is the fact that it's reflective, this poem, of conventions or features of romantic poetry. Romantic poetry often foregrounded or explored emotional experiences. In a sense, it foregrounded senses over reason and science and the intellect. So that's one link we can make between this poem and the Romantic era, because of course this poem explores her grief in realising that Grandad's going to die. But, and perhaps this is the cleverer contextual link, we can also say this poem reflects the conventions of romantic poetry, because the main character, the key protagonist if you will, is not drawn from the higher ranks of society. It's a child. It's a normal, everyday child. Think about your Shakespeare plays, your Restoration comedies, Augustan poetry. The poor are often rolled out in these texts for comedy value. Those bumbling poor folk, spud-faced simpletons they was. But led by romantic poets like Coleridge and Wordsworth, romantic poetry saw a shift away from these high-status protagonists, away from a patronising, belittling presentation of the poor, and would often present poor characters as the focal point of their poems. Not always, of course. You've got the knight in La Belle Dame sans Merci, you've got the Duke in My Last Duchess, but in some sense there was more of a sense of equality in romantic literature. The poor, their experience of life was addressed as frequently as the rich and noble. So we've got our box set, haven't we? 2 features of language, 2 of structure, and we've looked at 2 contextual factors. What we're doing now is stitching some of this stuff into the kind of honeyed exam responses that are going to send our exam grade hurtling skywards. And here it is. Compare how is presented in A Child to His Sick Grandfather and one other poem. In your answers, you should consider the poet's use of language and structure, and also relevant contextual factors. And you'll notice here that I've pasted in a theme that the question will address. Compare how death and injury are presented in this poem and one other. That's what our paragraphs are going to focus on. And here's the first part of one idea that I've explored in relation to that question, focusing on death and illness. I'll read it out. Baillie's poem employs metaphor to present the theme of death. The young narrator assures her aging relative that when the fire turns blue, I'll sit and talk with you. On a literal level, this serves to engage and emphasise to the reader the depth of the child's love. He is prepared to keep the old man company until late in the day. You'll notice I've highlighted key bits here of best practice. I've highlighted the fact that we've used metaphor. Always get a brownie point for mentioning that language or structural technique. And present and death are keywords from the question. That means my response is going to be relevant. I'm using high-level terminology like narrator rather than the wee laddie talking to you or the boy talking to you. And I've embedded the quote as well. That quotation stitched into my own sentence so that it flows. It's not just when the fire turns blue, blah, blah, blah. It's the young narrator assures his aging relative that when the fire turns blue, blah, blah, blah. It's a small thing, makes a difference to an examiner. I've talked about the literal meaning first, haven't I? Saying that this line reveals the depth of the child's love. And when I'm talking about those effects, I've explicitly stated the reader, because you get a brownie point. You know, the examiner throws you a fish to mix my metaphors if you do that. Finally, I've used an evaluative term like engagingly. This is, in a sense, a high-level student judging the text and kind of gauging its efficacy, its effectiveness. But the stuff in blue is a mere starter for the hearty main course in red. This is the money shot stuff. However, the line can be read metaphorically. The dying of the fire, turning blue, can symbolise to the reader the idea that the child will stay with her grandfather during his inevitable decline towards death, towards the diminishing of the flame of life. So this secondary, this deeper analysis is obviously going to be squeezing out a few remarks with the examiner. I've got high-level terms like metaphorically and symbolise. I'm still mentioning the reader, and I'm giving that secondary interpretation, using the word death again in that last line just to make sure that I'm linking back to the question, keeping it all relevant. And as if that wasn't enough, we forged a relevant contextual link to the poem. Let's have a read. Such devotion to a father figure reflects Baillie's religious upbringing. Raised a Christian, a Presbyterian, she would be conditioned by the Bible to abide by the commandment, honour thy father and mother. And there you've got the highlighter, just identifying the key bits of that contextual paragraph. Some final gifts for you before I bow out. The greatest gift of all being that you'll be spared my nasal northern voice. I'm just going to give you some paragraphs without the ear bashing. I've laid on a comparative paragraph linking this poem and that idea about death and injury to Vernon Scannell's Nettles, which is also in the relationships cluster for Edexcel. After that, there's another beautiful, fine essay paragraph addressing that structural feature in Baillie's poem, the rhyme scheme, and again linking that to the theme of death and injury, and again yoking in a relevant contextual factor. There'll be minimal yakety yak from me after this slide, I promise. This promo is just showing that for the price of a pickled egg, you can get the exam equivalent of a performance-enhancing drug. Well worth checking out. A reminder of the exam question that our essay paragraphs will be responding to. And here's that comparative paragraph, which I won't read to you. Suffice to say, underlined there are key words linking back to that question. Ava Shufti. And a similar setup for that parting gift that I promised you. Another paragraph on Baillie's poem, this time looking at a structural feature and again yoking in relevant contextual detail. And we're done. We might not like the poem, we might think it's sentimental bilge no matter how much we love our granddads, but the main thing is we've got a slew of stuff to say on it that the examiner's going to love. As they say in France, à bientôt.